We're discussing late 1700 conversations around the Negroes' intellectual ability, which obviously was important at that time because of what it implied in regards to slavery and also humane treatment of the victims of that institution. And so our main character in this discussion is still Mr. Thomas Jefferson. And we're also going to get some other inputs from different writers from his time, which will give us a better understanding on how to approach this topic. So pay attention because it's about to get very interesting. Now let's commence our studies by going into the book right here called White Over Black by the Triple OG Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan. So let's go in here on page 453 where he writes this. Thus Jefferson suspected that the Creator might have in fact created men unequal, and he could not say this without giving his assertion exactly the same logical force as his famous statement to the contrary. What famous statement did Mr. Jefferson make? It was his written statement in the Declaration of Independence that claimed that all men were created equal. But the dilemma was that Jefferson was also under the suspicion that this may not have been the case for those who they labeled as blacks, right? He was suspicious about their natural intellectual abilities. And we know one thing for sure is that he at least viewed them as humans because we can see in his statements that he wrote about the Negro Benjamin Banneker that he called him a free man, right? So he didn't think of them as subhumans, but he did make suggestions about them being at the bottom of the rung of the human family, right? In terms of logical thinking. All right, so let's keep going. His science theology rammed squarely into his larger faith, and the result was intellectual wreckage. In the notes, for example, he explained the Indians' apparent deficiencies as resulting wholly from environmental influences. Yet in 1785, he wrote to the Marquis de Chastellux,
I believe the Indian, then, to be in body and mind equal to the white man.
When you read the extended version of this quote, Jefferson states that he conversed with many Indians in North America and that he found them equal in intellectual abilities to other whites in a similar uncultivated state, right? That's the key there. And so this is the little context on the quote about the Indians. But what about the blacks? Here we go.
I have supposed the black man, in his present state, might not be so.
He talked to many of them too, but he was not convinced. It's like it's a combination of him trying to appear honest, but also being bogged down with heavy biases, right? That's how I'm viewing Jefferson on this particular topic. And this is what else he wrote.
But it would be hazardous to affirm that, equally cultivated for a few generations, he would not become so.
He's saying that he won't go as far as saying that if they were given the same opportunity and the same training as the whites for a few generations, then they wouldn't be equal in moral and intellectual ability, right? He's saying he won't go that far. This was all very well as a declaration of faith, but intellectually, it made no sense at all. Logically, the Indian could retrieve an original equality, but if the Negro was not originally equal, he could never become so, not if equality really stemmed from that equal creation from which Jefferson had derived it in the Declaration. As he grew older, Jefferson grew increasingly irritated on the subject, dimly aware of the trap in which he was placed. When in 1809 the Abbé Henri Gregoire sent him a book puffing the extraordinary achievements of various Negroes, he replied to Gregoire with his usual protestations of inconclusiveness.
Be assured that no person living wishes more sincerely than I do to see a complete refutation of the doubts I have myself entertained and expressed on the grade of understanding allotted to them by nature, and to find that in this respect they are on a par with ourselves.
Now here he goes again with all the hoping and the wishing, all the tiptoeing and doing the Jefferson jerk, right? Faking the funk with all these words and no actions to support these words, right? Now here's what else he says.
My doubts were the result of personal observation on the limited sphere of my own state, where the opportunities for the development of their genius were not favorable, and those of exercising it still less so. I expressed them, therefore, with great hesitation.
So we can see that he was fully aware of environmental influences on the expression of genius. And so why not just keep it as that, or not speak on it at all if it was such a great hesitation, right? This is one of the confusing things about Jefferson because he didn't have to voice his opinion on such a matter, right? If it was such a great hesitancy and he was so uncertain about it, he could have just kept silent, right? But let's keep reading. Jefferson exploded to his friend, Joel Barlow,
that the book in question was a fantastic collection of unauthenticated tales, though he had given Gregoire a very soft answer.
The book that he's talking about is the book that we heard about earlier, which was given to Jefferson and included puffed up achievements of various Negroes, right? And here's Jefferson's response.
The whole do not amount, in point of evidence, to what we know ourselves of Banneker.
Which is to say that Jefferson was not really impressed, right, when comparing it to the likes of Benjamin Banneker, who created almanacs using astronomical calculations. And the truth is, maybe he wasn't really impressed, right? Who knows? But let's keep reading.
As for that case, Jefferson declared,
we know he had spherical trigonometry enough to make almanacs, but not without the suspicion of aid from Ellicott, who was his neighbor and friend, and never missed an opportunity of puffing him.
Thomas Jefferson was suspicious about Benjamin Banneker being responsible for all of his work. Andrew Ellicott was a land surveyor who was certainly good at math, and Jefferson most likely considered this as a part of his suspicion. Here we go.
I have a long letter from Banneker, which shows him to have had a mind of very common stature indeed.
Which is to minimize Banneker's intelligence to that of an average person. Or Jefferson is basically implying that in that letter, he didn't notice anything that was impressive about Banneker's intellectual capabilities, right? That's his take on it. Let's keep going.
Jefferson had become irritated, one might well conclude, by contact with an issue he could not successfully handle. And on this issue, one looks in vain for indications of a happily receptive scientific mind, patiently awaiting appropriate evidence. Had he been so inclined, Jefferson could easily have welcomed Banneker as a fragment of proof. Many other men had done so, including Southerners like James McHenry. Banneker's achievements, moreover, were of just the sort to appeal to Jefferson, for scientific endeavor, however modest, was always of interest to him. He had lionized David Rittenhouse, whose principal achievement was a mechanical model of the universe, the famous orrery. Consider, he wrote its constructor urging continued endeavor, that the world has but one Rittenhouse.
And if you recall in the last video, David Rittenhouse approved the almanac that was created by Benjamin Banneker.
Banneker's almanac was indeed modest by comparison, but Banneker possessed that virtue which most attracted Republican scientists to Rittenhouse. He was self-taught,
which takes motivation, determination, and focus. And obviously he possessed those qualities to a high enough degree to take it upon himself to teach himself.
Indeed, it was the scientific aspect of Banneker's achievement which confirmed his celebrity, and that also of Derham and Fuller. If the evidence of intellect was sought, what more likely field than science? Banneker was better proof even than Phillis Wheatley.
Wheatley wrote poems, and although poetry was a very useful talent, it was not the talent that people like Jefferson were suspicious about. Pay attention.
Nothing could point more clearly to the late 18th century separation of intellect from morals than the arresting fact that no abolitionist seized upon Negroes like Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and Prince Hall as exemplars of Negro capacity. Allen and Jones, both well-known ministers in Philadelphia, and Hall, leader of the active Negro community in Boston, were in all probability more able men than Banneker. Benjamin Rush was well acquainted with Allen and Jones, yet he never attempted to parade them as examples of Negro equality, nor did any other anti-slavery writer. No Negro minister, such as John Chavis, who attended Princeton, was so used, nor did the fame of individual Negroes depend upon getting their writings into print, for Fuller and Derham did not publish anything, while Allen and Jones did.
So ministering the word of God and getting some writings in print was not impressive enough for the anti-slavery writers to use as examples of Negro intellectual ability. And here we go. He's about to explain why.
White Americans simply assumed that Negroes possessed religious and even quasi-political abilities. Doubts on this point would have been doubts about the Negro's status as a human being.
They already knew a Negro could whip up a sermon, write poetry, and get involved in politics, right? That wasn't the area of doubt. Pay attention.
The Negro was to be judged on a thoroughly distinct matter, his intellectual capacity.
The area of doubt was, could they think logically to figure out solutions to problems, or was that faculty of the mind just naturally restricted, right? This is what they're talking about, and this is what they're looking for. And this is the reason why the anti-slavery writers didn't use Phillis Wheatley and the Princeton minister John Chavis as examples, because that wasn't going to cut it, right? Let's keep going.
Until well into the 19th century, Jefferson's judgment on that matter, with all its confused tentativeness, stood as the strongest suggestion of inferiority expressed by any Native American.
And what was Jefferson's judgment on the matter? He suspected blacks were naturally inferior in the intellectual department, although he seems very confused throughout many of his written records.
To some extent, sectional differences help account for his opinion, for Jefferson was the only person in Virginia or southward to tackle the problem, and his opponents were chiefly Northerners. He wrote at length on a matter upon which Virginians generally were silent, but he may well have been speaking for many of them. His acquaintance, St. George Tucker, a Virginia lawyer, referred casually in 1795 to
the general opinion of their mental inferiority.
But this statement appears to be the only contemporary testimony concerning what Virginian opinion actually was. It is striking that even when defending slavery, Virginians seem to have felt no need to advance suggestions of Negro inferiority. Similarly, Governor John Drayton of South Carolina, one of a handful of men in that state to aspire successfully to authorship, defended slavery at some length in 1802, chiefly on grounds of necessity, and without once mentioning the possibility of Negro inferiority. The only Southerner to object directly to Jefferson about the remarks in the notes was David Ramsey. Both a physician and a historian, Ramsey had been born in Pennsylvania and had migrated to Charleston at age 23, where he became a moderately successful politician. Though he owned slaves, he was regarded by many persons in the state as distinctly unsound on the subject of slavery. It is therefore perhaps not surprising that after reading Jefferson's notes in manuscript, he wrote to congratulate the author and commented unfavorably on only one passage.
Uh-oh.
I admire your generous indignation at slavery, but think you have depressed the Negroes too low.
Jefferson, man, I like what you're doing and I really admire it. But on this point right here, I think you went too far, right? You put them way too far down into the pit. You see that?
Opinion in the North, on the other hand, was distinctly different, though far from unanimous. When St. George Tucker addressed queries concerning Negroes in Massachusetts to Jeremy Belknap in 1795, he asked specifically for information concerning mental capacity, and Belknap in turn made inquiries among his prominent friends in Boston. Judge James Winthrop replied magisterially,
"There are a few instances of their appearing as authors, and some of their productions are not contemptible."
Meaning some of the things they produced were not that bad. They weren't the greatest things either, but they were not really all that bad.
I have not heard of their dipping into the more abstruse parts of science, and in general they are not estimated for speculative abilities.
And so he had not heard of blacks being involved in those areas at that time, right? And he's also saying that they were not looked at as skilled in speculative abilities. And so what does that mean? That means being able to engage in concepts beyond the immediate physical realm, right? Being able to navigate the world of imagination and the world of ideas, and to interact with abstract concepts for future possibilities or problem solving, right? Like if I do such and such today as a cause, then proceed with a set of logical steps to speculate in the mind the future effects of that cause, right? And this is what he's claiming that the blacks were not good at doing during that time. Let's keep going.
James Sullivan, less pompous but more verbose, explained that Negroes were not now the equal of whites, but that if they were given the same
prospects, motives, and advantages
for 3 or 4 generations,
they may exceed the white people.
Now let's deal with this over the next few generations idea, right? For him to make this remark, it reveals a lot about the understanding that they had at that time. For one, they understood that Negroes and their mentality and their abilities were not fixed, but instead they were fluid, right? And when given the right opportunity, benefits, and the right reasons, they could exceed that of the whites, right? That's what he's saying. And Jefferson, he knew this too, right? Which is why we heard him earlier say that if the blacks were properly cultivated after a few generations, then they may be equal to the whites, right? And so they know the importance, or they understood the importance of environment and opportunity and how it influenced culture and character development. Now, on the inverse, who else had this understanding? The earlier colonizers, right, who created the colonial social system in America. They knew that if they removed the opportunities and they manufactured an environment in such a way where it restricted the development of human abilities, then the victims of that creation would be stuck with those consequences over multiple generations. Understand? They knew this when they were creating it, right? They knew that blacks would lose their minds and would be left as wanderers for many generations. Why? Because they understood that if they destroyed the mind of the blacks in the very beginning, that they would continue making copies of themselves as each generation unfolded, until finally there emerged enough people who broke away from that cycle of consciousness reproduction, right? Understand? This here is the type of knowledge that they were dealing with. And this is why they could predict that if given a certain amount of opportunity and the right environment, the blacks could be equal or even outperform the whites, right? Understand? Let's keep reading.
Belknap summarized his little survey by reporting that gentlemen in Massachusetts who had studied the matter
do not scruple to say that there is no more difference between them and those whites who have had the same education and have lived in the same habits than there is among different persons of that class of whites. In this opinion I am inclined to acquiesce. It is neither birth nor color, but education and habit which form the human character.
Right? Nothing to do with skin color like the colonists tricked everyone into believing. But it's more about education and habit. Now, what is a habit? It's a pattern of behavior that you repeatedly do without thinking much about it, right? And these habits or these patterns, they're learnable and they're also unlearnable. And so, for example, when people are faced with problems and challenges, some people's automatic pattern is to conjure up thoughts around why this problem can't be fixed or why they can't do anything about it, or why it's everyone else's fault, right? And so on and so forth. And this person gets defeated by their problems, right? While on the other hand, you have others who have a habit of responding to their problems in the opposite manner, right? And they overcome their problems, right? Instead of being defeated by them. And the thing is that each of these habits can be learned and unlearned, right? And so for each of these examples, the blamer can learn to take on responsibility, while the responsible person can learn to blame other people, right? And this is the versatility of the human. And Belknap knew that, right? Which is why he was able to say that it was not the color, but the habit that formed the human character, all right? Let's keep going.
Though it is difficult to judge exactly what most Virginians or other Southerners would have thought of this statement, it is clear that only one man in the South felt compelled to take the opposite position publicly. Jefferson alone spoke forth, and this fact in itself suggests at very least strong feeling on his part and uncommon need to discourse upon the subject. It was not that he alone felt need for scientific experiment. George Wythe, Jefferson's much admired mentor, undertook to give both his own nephew and his mulatto servant boy classical educations as a comparative test of the Negro's ability. On the other hand, Jefferson, who delighted in compiling the facts of the natural world, never attempted any such experiment despite ample opportunity. And the structure of his relevant passage in the notes, where his appeal to science followed lengthy and very definite pronouncements on Negro inferiority, indicated clearly that his appeal to that highest court was not the starting point for his thoughts about Negroes, but a safe refuge from them.
All right, there we have it. Another look into the mind of Jefferson and others on the topic of intellectual development within the Negro. And so hopefully you have found this video valuable and worthy of your time. I want to thank you right now for watching all the way until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.